I'm Anita today. You know, Anita had knee replacement on the 1st of February, and then she had a few complications from that. But she's doing well, but she did need to get out today. But a little bit of the business she needs me to do next month. I'm going to pass this around while I'm talking. As you know, the cooking lady, Ann Hollowell, will be here, and Kappa Kappa Iota are the hostesses, and they really don't have very many members. So she said if anybody could help sign up to bring some food, that would be great. Also, I've stuck a little card in here for her if you want to sign it, and I'll just start that around while we get going. I appreciate it. This will be a very good program. Now, I also have the book review today, and so without further ado, that's right, a one-man show. That's right. I'm used to that, for children anyway. But the book that I'm reviewing today for President's Month and Black History Month, and it is in the library, and I'm going to give you a brief review, so if you want to delve into this subject, do so. It's a very, very interesting book. Jefferson's Daughters, Three Sisters, White and Black in a Young America. It's written by Dr. Catherine Carrison. She's Associate Professor of History at Villanova University, and she has a PhD from William and Mary College. She explains in the book how difficult it was to find much information, especially on Harriet, the daughter Harriet, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There are 55 pages of footnotes in the book, so she did an extreme amount of research. She really did. But where there was no research, she just said maybe, or this could have happened, or this probably was the way they lived, or that kind of thing. So she had to read between the lines on some of it. I read the reviews online after I'd read the book just to see. And they were mixed. Most of them said the book was too long, and it is long. It said too detailed, and it is detailed. The biggest complaint was that it was written in chronological order, starting in 1772 and going through like 1822 or beyond. And so it was really hard to, weave into that and figure out what was going on. I have taken the daughters one by one. Now, some of it, of course, is going to overlap, but I think it'll be easier to understand. Like I say, this is going to be very, very brief. As in U.S. history and sometimes today, a lot of people have the same name. So try to, grandmother was Martha, mother was Martha, granddaughter, on and down. And so Maria was called Mary, and, that's kind of the way they did things back then. So I'll try to explain that. But the book begins in 1772 with the marriage of Thomas Jefferson, who was 29 years old, to Martha Wales, a young widow who was fair like he was, auburn hair like he was, and she was a very beautiful woman. He'd been in the Virginia legislature for 3 years at that time, so he just started his political career. And as you know, by 1801, he becomes the 3rd president of the United States. At this time, when he marries, he's not quite there, and Monticello is not built completely. There's very little of it there, and so when he takes his new bride there, it's still very, very rough living for a while. Their first child, Martha, named after her mother and her grandmother, and while they were married, she had a succession of 5 pregnancies. But as the book said, there are only 2 of the daughters lived to adulthood, and those are 2 of the 3 in the book, mentioned in the book. Maria was the other child who lived to adulthood. Martha was born in 1772. Thomas Jefferson and Martha Wales married on New Year's Day, and again was named after her mother and grandmother. She was like her father. She was gangly. She was described as large and loosely made. Poor thing, I kind of felt for her. So she had too many likenesses of Thomas Jefferson to be termed beautiful, as the author said, but she had a very intelligent face, so I thought that was good for her. Her first teacher, of course, would have been her mother. There were no schools in Charlottesville, Virginia at the time, even for boys. So she would have, anything she was taught, she would have been taught at home. And that would have been maybe some reading, writing, music, some French perhaps. These were important things in those days. Now Martha, the mother, died when Martha, the daughter, was 9. And so Thomas Jefferson was just plunged into inconsolable grief. And he took this little girl as his confidant. And she was his constant companion. And she later wrote in her life, she said, "In these melancholy rambles about the mountain," that's Monticello, "I was his constant companion, a solitary to many violent outbursts of grief." And that was hard for a little girl of 9 years old. When he went to Philadelphia later on as part of the new government, she went with him, and he wrote that her time in Philadelphia will be chiefly occupied with acquiring a little taste and execution of the fine arts. So he hired the very exclusive tutors to teach Martha and to refine her. In 1784, at the age of 12, she accompanied him to Paris. You know, he was chosen to help negotiate the peace with Great Britain. John Adams was over there, and he went over there too, and he was in Paris. And he took Martha, the daughter, with him to Paris, and she loved Paris. She loved everything French. She really, really got into the lifestyle of the French. Now, they were very different from colonial America over there. She had to have a complete makeover as far as the way she dressed and looked, and the book said she stopped short of the hair, you know, the French hair. Think Marie Antoinette, you know, and the hair that goes up to here. She did not have that, but she did do that, and she was introduced into society in the court of Louis XV in Paris. So she had a very exciting life in France. She learned to speak French, and when she returned to the United States, she could barely speak English anymore. They had a hard time adjusting back and forth to those things. She loved learning. It was very intelligent. He entered her into a convent school in Paris, one of the most exclusive schools in Paris. And she flourished there, and she changed from that awkward, gangly young woman to a very self-confident, poised young woman. Now, she loved Roman Catholicism. That wasn't really popular back in the days in the colonies either. And it was reported in an English paper that the nuns had seduced Miss Jefferson into changing her religion. And there's a legend in the Jefferson family that when he received a letter from her saying that she was going to convert to Catholicism, that he immediately took her out of that convent. So that's probably true. She didn't want to leave there. While she was there, her ideas about slavery changed. There was no slavery in France. And she came to embrace that at that time. Now, she didn't, you know, stay that way as far as we could tell. They came back home, and 2 months later she married her first cousin, Thomas Mann Randolph. And he was not the love of her life, I would say, according to the book. He was tall and handsome, well educated, but he also had a bad temper. And he was always sick. That was one thing in the book. They were always going to spas to see if he could feel. I couldn't tell if he was a hypochondriac or if he was really sick. I don't know. But he certainly thought that he was sick a lot, so I guess he did. He was in debt at the time that they married, but he was well educated, and for some reason Thomas Jefferson liked him, and so he was all for that. Thomas Randolph would later become the governor of Virginia at that time. Now, she didn't want, again, to leave Paris. And she didn't, I think one reason she might have, according to this author, married so soon after returning is that she really didn't want to return to the life of almost a domestic, you know, at her father's home. But because her husband was so debt-ridden, they did end up living a lot at Monticello. Her husband, Thomas Mann Randolph, died in 1828. By the age of 36, Martha had borne 12 children and was the mother of 8. And this is where she gave her life. She taught them French, she taught them reading, she taught them writing, and she taught them self-discipline. Her girls practiced piano for hours every day, and an overseer from Monticello at that time wrote, "Mrs. Randolph is just like her father, always busy." And then a friend wrote that all Mrs. R's children eat at family table. You know, that wasn't common, but are in such order that you would not know if you had not seen them that a child was present. So she also educated her daughters, which was sort of with a classical education, which was unheard of at the time. That was completely reserved for boys. So you can see again where the French influence came into her life when she got back and she educated her children. And since her husband's indebtedness grew and grew, her daughters were not going to have large dowries. And she wanted them to be educated, but she also wanted them to know how to run a house. And so she rotated the keys of the household amongst her daughters so that they could take turns knowing how to run a house there. Now by 1820, Monticello, all of its the house, the contents, and all of the slaves had been sold at auction to repay the debts that Thomas Jefferson had accrued in his lifetime. So Martha spent the rest of her life penniless, and she had to move between her children. She did have 8 of them that were living, so that was a good thing. But she spent the rest of her life shuttling back and forth between her children. She died in 1836, 8 years after her husband, at the age of 64. But you know, thinking back on her life and seeing, she had led a full life. She had lived in Paris. She had lived in Virginia and Richmond when it was the capital, when Thomas Jefferson was the governor. And she'd had to flee from the British. I mean, she had an exciting life in that way. So that was Martha's life in a nutshell. The next daughter to survive was Maria, who survived childhood, and she was born in 1778. And she was 2 when her mother died. So she really didn't know her mother at all. And she was totally opposite in personality from Martha. Martha was self-disciplined and organized, and Maria was not. Today we would call Maria a free spirit. They didn't have many of those back then. Martha loved to study, and Maria did not. Martha wrote letters, and this is how we find out about people from those days, because they wrote letters, and Maria did not. So there's not as much to be known about her because she did not write letters. Martha looked like Thomas Jefferson. Maria did not. She looked like her mother, and she was termed to be a beauty. She was petite like her mother, and auburn hair, and very, very, very beautiful. Now Martha, when she accompanied her father to Paris, Maria had to stay behind with his sister at Eppington, and they called his sister Aunt Epps. Now remember, this little girl had died, her mother had died when she was so young, she didn't know her, so she attached to Aunt Epps and loved Aunt Epps dearly. And another child, Lucy, also stayed at Eppington, while Thomas Jefferson was in Paris with Martha at that time. Maria was 4 and when she went there. Now Lucy died of whooping cough while they were there, so again, she did not survive to adulthood. It's really sad when you see how many children were lost by these people, that died either at birth or in infancy or young childhood. In 1887, however, at age 9, Thomas Jefferson insisted that Maria come to Paris also. She did not want to leave Aunt Epps. She did not want to. She was only 9 years old, and he said she had to come, and they wrote letters back and forth. The sister said no, she doesn't need to come, and he said yes, she's coming, and finally, begrudgingly, she went to Paris. But when she got there, she loved it too. Paris must have been, of course, very, very different from the colonies, because they really did. No, and when she got there, he didn't even know who she was. I mean, he didn't recognize her, and she didn't recognize him. But she'd been so little when he left, and so several years had passed. And so even she, when it was time to return to Virginia, just broke down in tears and did not want to leave Paris. Can kind of understand that, because they just had a war there too, and things didn't look too good. Now, accompanying her to Paris, she also accompanied her to Eppington when she went, was her personal maid, Sally Hemings. Sally was 14 years old when she went with Maria to Paris to take care of her. Now, before she got all the way to Paris, she stayed in England with Abigail Adams. You know, we've talked about Abigail Adams before, and Abigail Adams was greatly impressed with Maria. She said her temper, her disposition, her sensibility are all formed to delight. And I guess she did delight, and she was pretty too. Her years in Paris were not as dramatic as Martha's. She didn't want to join a convent. You know, Martha wore the cockade of the French Revolution everywhere she went. So Maria didn't do that either. She wasn't quite into that, but she did study French, and she became fluent in French. And again, when she got home, she had a hard time speaking English again. And penmanship she learned while she was there. Went to the same convent that Martha did. And so she made friends easily. People liked her, and Sally was with her all this time. And Sally was right in there in the French, you know, the society. Wherever, you know, Maria was, Sally was. And people liked Sally also. Now, when she came back, it said that she sobbed when she came into Norfolk, Virginia, because of all the devastation left over from the war. It was not beautiful like Paris. As she took up her studies again with Martha, her sister, as her teacher, but Martha thought she was lazy because she didn't really like to study. And in 1791, Maria was taken to Philadelphia with Thomas Jefferson, and again taught by tutors, and became especially acquainted with Martha Washington, whose husband was the president at the time, and friends with Nellie Custis, who was, of course, Martha's granddaughter. While there, she started having feelings of love for her cousin and childhood friend, Jack Epps. You remember Aunt Epps? This is her son, Jack, who is Maria's first cousin. And I think I told you the other, Jack Thomas Randolph was her third cousin, not her first cousin. And by 1795, there were two men vying for her hand, a much older man than Jack Epps. But, you know, she was beautiful, she was educated, she was the daughter of respected and presumed wealthy politician. So she was considered quite a prize in the marriage department. And her father favored this man that was vying for her hand, who was 16 years older than she, and he had a reputation for audacity and fearlessness in attacking the executive branch of the government, who was George Washington. So you know I didn't like him right from the start. But Thomas Jefferson did like him. But Maria, again, unlike Martha, who was, you know, her father's constant companion since she was 9 years old, she didn't, you know, listen to him all that much. Again, free spirit, think free spirit. So she knew her own mind, and she decided she was going to marry who she wanted to marry. So she married Jack Epps, her cousin, and she adored him. They were lifelong friends, and they had a very happy marriage in most respects. He was not dependent on Thomas Jefferson because he was wealthy in his own right, and he didn't have to depend on him like Thomas Randolph did. So from all accounts, they had a wonderful marriage, except for one thing, was that she had a very difficult time in childbirth. And she had 4 pregnancies, 3 live births, and 1 miscarriage in their 7-year marriage. But only 1 child survived. And he never knew her because she died shortly after. Well, she had another child after he was born, and she died then. So Maria always thought Thomas Jefferson loved Martha the most, which, you know, that happens sometimes. And she did try to, you know, show him that she loved him. But Thomas Jefferson's biographer, Dumas Malone, ended his account of Maria's life by saying this: "The author of the Declaration of Independence did not succeed in molding his second daughter in his own image, since she never conformed to his wishes." Remember, she didn't want to go to Paris, she didn't like to write letters, she didn't like to study, you know, all those things were very important to him. So her only child to survive was born in 1801, and she died in 1804. Now, after her death, Jack, her beloved husband, fathered several children with a slave, Betsy Hemings. And it's said in the book that he was so grief-stricken that he didn't want to marry again. Now, the third daughter, Harriet. You'll have to follow the timeline here. Harriet was one of 7 children born to Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Now, Sally Hemings was the 14-year-old girl who went with Maria to Paris. And so as her personal maid, she was there. Now, in 1802, a journalist, James Callender, publicly exposed Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. And it said that Martha was humiliated by this for the rest of her life. Thomas Jefferson never answered any charges about that. In France, Sally was not a slave, and she was paid well above any of the wages that maids, personal maids, were paid in France by Thomas Jefferson. He paid her. It's not known exactly when their relationship began, but it is known that when it was time to go back to the United States, she said she wasn't going. She was going to stay there and be free, live in glittering Paris, and I mean, you can't blame her for that. So she refused to return. And somehow he talked her into it, but she was wise enough to say, I will go back if you will give my children their freedom when they are 21 years old. And he agreed to that. He agreed to that. And nothing was written down, and as the book said, every law in Virginia would have been on his side if he just said, I'm not doing that. Once you get back, I'm not doing that. There was no law, and he didn't sign anything, but evidently, to a point, he kept this vow that he had made to her. They did go free when they turned 21 years old. And their children lived differently than the other slave children. They didn't begin work until 14, and they never worked in the field. Now, we know this from Thomas Jefferson's farm book, it's called, where he kept a record of everything, that happened on the farm. He did, however, stop short and never gave them manumission papers. They never had papers they could show to show that they were free. So he never did do that for them. So they weren't officially free, but he did let them go. According to, again, the farm book, Harriet was never assigned to duty in the kitchen. She worked in his textile factory from the time she was 14, which gave her a skill that she could use when she left there. And she learned the newest technology, the spinning jenny. That was the newest technology at that time. And that would perhaps become beneficial to her. Now, Harriet's grandmother, Elizabeth Hennings, Sally's mother, got it? Had born, this is terrible, had born 6 children to John Wales, Martha Jefferson's, the wife, to her father. So Sally Hemings and Martha Jefferson, Thomas's wife, were half-sisters. They were half-sisters. I'm assuming Martha knew that. That was one of the things when she married, the Hemings family was given to her at Monticello. It seems like an odd arrangement, but that's the way it was. So Harriet was born to Sally and Thomas Jefferson in 1801, and she was the 5th child born to them. Harriet was described as 7/8 white, and according to Edmund Bacon, an overseer there at Monticello, nearly as white as anybody and very beautiful. Harriet had an older brother, Beverly, and younger brothers, Madison, Eston, John, and an older sister, Mary. And all of these names are Jefferson family names. Check my time. Harriet was 8 before Thomas Jefferson returned to Monticello permanently. He was president from 1801 to 1809. She was born in 1801. So she was raised by her mother. Now remember, Sally had lived in Paris and could speak French and was, probably, as this author said, a very wonderful mother to teach her things. And again, Maria's friends inquired about her in letters that they'd written. And according to Ellen Randolph, who is Martha Jefferson's daughter, Martha the daughter's daughter, Thomas Jefferson's granddaughter, all of Sally's children were fair, and there's some pictures in the book, and they were fair. Dr. Carrison, in writing, says thinking about Harriet's life, requires peering into the shadows, asking questions to which answers are not always discoverable, and that's true. When Harriet left Monticello at age 21, she basically disappeared. For her own good, she did. So it's not known where she went the day she left. The overseer at the time said that he put her on a stagecoach to Philadelphia and was given $50 by Thomas Jefferson to give her. Some people, the author here, thinks she went to what was called Washington City at the time, because that's where Beverly had gone, her brother, and he lived there as a white man. So it's possible she went there. Her other brother, Madison, now we know more about her from Madison than anywhere else, but we don't know, she did not leave a trail at all. And Thomas Jefferson wrote in his book, farm book, the word run by her name when he let her go, because he didn't want a paper trail. He didn't want anybody to know, evidently, what was going on there. But Madison wrote about her that when Beverly went to Washington as a white man, so she thought, talking about Harriet, it was to her interest on going on to Washington to assume the role of a white woman. 50 years after she left Monticello, her brother Madison wrote, "By her dress and conduct as such, I am not aware that her identity as Harriet Hemings of Monticello has ever been discovered." She was smart. She was smart. There were still all of the laws in place that, you could not have any, not a drop of black blood in you. Now, Catherine Carrison documents in this book the 58 Harriets she researched trying to find Harriet Hemings. 58 people named Harriet. She never found conclusively. So there's ultimately no record, she says, of Harriet after 1822. There's just nothing about her. According to her brother Madison, she married a white man in Washington City whose identity she refused to reveal. So that was that. Now, 1998, DNA testing documented a connection between Sally Hemings' youngest child, Eston, who went on his children. One of them became a Civil War soldier. There were doctors and lawyers and businessmen in his family. He had a good life. But there was a connection between Sally Hemings' youngest child, Eston, and the Jefferson male line. That was, not met by many people with excitement, but then the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation published a report in 2000 concluding evidence pointing to a relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings that resulted in 4 surviving children. So that the Jefferson family and all have finally agreed to that in the year 2000. There are pictures in the back of this book. I know you can't see them. But they're, some of them kind of look like Thomas Jefferson. So they're, this is Beverly Frederick Jefferson and his 3 sons. And it says one served in the Wisconsin Regiment and during the Civil War. And then he returned to run the family business, a successful restaurant. And so Eston's descendants flourished in careers as doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. So those were some of the things here. And again, here's one of Eston's sons, and pictures that they have of them. So if you want to know more and you want to delve, really delve, check this book out and read it. And that would be a very good thing. And I thank you for coming. And I don't want to ask you if you have any questions because I can't answer them. Remember to come next week, next month to hear Ann Hollowell.